In September of 1965, hundreds of scientists and scholars gathered together on the National Mall to celebrate the 200th birthday of James Smithson, founder of the Smithsonian Institution. Organized by the institution's new secretary, S. Dillon Ripley, the three-day affair featured a mixture of pageantry and academic lectures showcasing the Smithsonian's contributions to science and culture. Among the speakers was famed French anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss, who spoke to the crowd about the achievements of Smithsonian anthropology and its opportunities for the future. Lauding the past efforts of the institution's Bureau of American Ethnology in documenting the country's vanishing indigenous populations, he cautioned his audience that similar measures now needed to take place on a global scale. Many of the world's societies were disappearing, he told them, rapidly adapting to new ways of life in the years after World War II. Noting recent achievements in the physical sciences, he compared the need for increased anthropological fieldwork to the response to the hypothetical discovery of an unknown planet, and urged his listeners to take up the task of assembling a record of these cultures before it was too late. And I'm not going to read this quote because it's repurposed everywhere, but do keep it in mind as I continue on with my talk. Now, inspired by this speech, members of the Smithsonian's administration and staff began work on an international salvage research program in anthropology that was intended to match the spirit and scope of larger initiatives such as the International Geophysical Year and the International Biological Program. Coined urgent anthropology by its main organizers, Secretary Ripley and University of Chicago anthropologist Saul Tax, the program followed in the salvage tradition of the Bureau of American Ethnology and set out to document linguistic, behavioral, and cultural data from so-called disappearing peoples across the globe. Yet under their leadership, as I will argue, the program quickly grew beyond this focus, inspiring a series of projects and affiliated programs targeting a much broader scope of scientific and social issues. These expanded aims included topics such as environmental conservation, social activism and outreach, and the preservation of cultural and biological diversity, among others. Such themes continue to influence the direction of Smithsonian anthropology and resonate with the objectives of current initiatives like Recovering Voices. By retracing the history and development of urgent anthropology, this talk showcases its persisting intellectual legacy within the institution and shows how expanding understandings of what it means to do urgent research highlights the importance of museums and archives for supporting innovative work that bridges the human and natural sciences. So I'm going to do this as quickly as I can in these 5 sections. So section 1 is going to focus on the collaboration between Ripley and Tax, and will emphasize their individual investments in starting a program of urgent anthropology. Section 2 will consider the logistics involved with planning the program and also highlight some points of tension within the broader discipline of anthropology during this period. Section 3 will look at the expanding ideas of urgent anthropology within the institution, particularly within the Center for the Study of Man and its efforts to bridge the environmental and anthropological sciences. Section 4 will look at some more concrete examples of how ideas of urgent anthropology actually became applied to specific programs, and I'm going to touch briefly on the Center for Short-Lived Phenomena, the Museum of Man, and the National Anthropological Film Center. And with my concluding thoughts, I'm going to attempt to connect urgent anthropology to current projects like Recovering Voices and suggest how this rhetoric of urgency may be helpful for bringing the Smithsonian Institution and its research into new areas of inquiry. All right, so section 1. In order to understand the foundations of urgent anthropology, it is first necessary to give you a bit of background on the personal interest and collaboration of its organizers, Dillon Ripley and Saul Tax. Elected by the Smithsonian Board of Regents in 1964 to serve as the institution's 8th secretary, Sidney Dillon Ripley arrived a man in the prime of his life and at the height of his career. Now, he came to the Smithsonian from Yale University, where he held a joint position in the Department of Biology and was also the director of the Peabody Museum of Natural History. But since he was an ornithologist by training, and here he is, he was also a leading contributor to the growing environmental movement and served as the president of the International Council for Bird Preservation beginning in 1958, and also maintained a small avicultural preserve for endangered waterfowl on his home estate in Litchfield, Connecticut. Like many of his colleagues at the time, he recognized the destructive influence of human beings on the physical environment, especially as increasing population numbers worldwide threatened the sustainability and management of natural resources. Yet, unlike many ecologists and biologists at the time, Ripley, who called for the removal of populations as a means of protecting and studying natural habitats, human beings made things too complicated for most of them. Ripley instead argued that you had to engage with a more integrative and holistic approach to the study of ecosystems. And in his view, environmental degradation could actually be best confronted by incorporating both biological and social scientific perspectives into the study of ecosystems. So he stressed then that biologists and ecologists needed to work in collaboration with social scientists, and especially anthropologists who could more fully comprehend the complex nuances and behaviors that governed human beings and their relationship to the environment. Now, one place that Ripley encouraged this kind of work was in the museum. So according to him, the relative flexibility that existed in museum departments allowed its staff and scientists to approach research projects in a more creative way than was perhaps possible in a university. He believed that the Smithsonian, as one of the world's leading museum complexes, therefore had an obligation to use its resources to support the most cutting-edge research. Yet upon his arrival in 1964, he found the institution to be a bit outdated and in desperate need of an upgrade. I felt the Smithsonian itself was a sleeping beauty, he later recalled. It had all of the necessary ingredients to make it great, but it seemed to me to be sort of resting. So determined to wake up the institution following his arrival, he authorized the formation of several new offices to support the kind of collaborative and creative work he envisioned. One of the first of these was actually the Office of Anthropological Research, which many of you may know merged the separate departments of the Bureau of American Ethnology with the Department of Anthropology and Natural History. So his justification for this was, in addition to removing the redundancy of having two separate budgets to fund anthropological work, it would also allow for more creative collaboration across the staff members and facilitate interaction with those working in another office that he created around the same time, the Office of Ecology. So by linking the activities of these offices, Ripley sought to promote a synthetic, ecologically rooted agenda for the Smithsonian's future programs, grounded in the intersection of studies on human beings and the environment, what he later termed as the human society plus environment approach to ecosystem analysis. Now, despite Ripley's optimism for the scientific possibilities of this merger, the consolidation of the BAE and the department met with anxiety among the Smithsonian's anthropologists. In particular, former members of the Bureau worried that their traditional focus on research and the assemblage of anthropological data would be neglected in favor of other tasks. Speaking on behalf of his Bureau colleagues, William Sturtevant emphasized that the Bureau's contributions to some anthropological topics, such as linguistics, reached beyond the capacities of the museum. And this is a quote from him. "If the BAE were transferred to the museum," he wrote, "there is a clear danger that in the course of time, the emphasis in hiring and other research support would be on material culture. Thus, instead of overcoming the divisions between the former Bureau and the department, the merger actually precipitated the factionalism that would persist throughout the 1960s and into the early 70s. Now, in one effort to, and here's Ripley in India. So part of his interest in this human environment interaction actually came from a number of travels that he did abroad in his early career throughout Southeast Asia, and I'm happy to talk more about in the Q&A if it's of interest. But in an effort to overcome the tensions that he witnessed in the Department of Anthropology, Ripley approached University of Chicago anthropologist Saul Tax to act as his special advisor on anthropology. Now, like Ripley, Tax had emerged as one of the leading thinkers and organizers of his discipline in the years after the war, a role that was mostly supported by his work with the newly formed Wenner Gren Foundation for Anthropological Research, and especially through his role as the founding editor of its journal, Current Anthropology. Now, as a vocal proponent of the need to establish a network of communication among the growing community of international anthropologists, he appeared an ideal figure to spearhead the unification of Smithsonian anthropology. In addition, his central role in planning the 1959 Darwin Centennial celebration at the University of Chicago proved him to be a sympathetic figure in Ripley's larger plans to bridge ecology and anthropology. For Tax, the opportunity to work at the Smithsonian promised a new forum in which to expand his method of action anthropology. An outcome of his fieldwork in collaboration with the Meskwaki community living in Tama, Iowa, action anthropology relied on this idea of mutual cooperation and communication between the anthropologists and the community under study as a way to identify and suggest solutions for that community's social, economic, and political needs. He argued that within the Smithsonian, action anthropology could actually benefit a wider audience through the construction of task forces and through the production of museum displays that would raise awareness of global social and scientific issues. In other words, the ability to experiment with the reach of action anthropology within the Smithsonian's museums offered the chance to demonstrate the value of the social sciences, especially at a time when innovations in the physical sciences were receiving top priority. Non-trivially, Ripley's decision to bring Tax on board as his advisor on anthropology actually coincided with the 1965 bicentennial celebration. So Tax was here at the Smithsonian during Levi-Strauss's speech and found himself agreeing with many of the points that he was presenting. Now, while Levi-Strauss had emphasized the need to document the lifeways of isolated societies whose small population size put them at risk of physical extinction, he also identified a second task that demanded a reevaluation of anthropology's ethnographic methods and echoed several of Tax's notions about action anthropology. Specifically, he commented on how some societies, especially those living in parts of Asia, Africa, and South America experiencing rapid development, had begun to modify their traditional ways of life, and in Levi-Strauss's words, were, quote, resembling more and more that of the Western world. At the same time, he noted how suspicion over anthropology's role in colonial projects had made it increasingly difficult for anthropologists to gain access to these parts of the world. He argued that more needed to be done to encourage members of these communities to become anthropologists in their own right, an idea that coincided with the collaborative imperative of action anthropology and the notion that communities could only make sense of their social, political, and economic issues on their own terms. Tax concurred with Levi-Strauss then that the Smithsonian, as a leader in anthropological research, could make significant strides in organizing the collection of ethnographic data of cultures undergoing change, and that the preservation of such data would prove beneficial to both scientists and those under study. It was thus with Levi-Strauss's call to arms in mind that he accepted Ripley's invitation to come to the Smithsonian. So Levi-Strauss's speech also resonated with Ripley's desires to include anthropology as part of his expanded approach for ecological and conservation research at the institution. So in November of 1965, just a few weeks after the bicentennial celebration, Ripley actually approached the Executive Council of the American Anthropological Association to offer the Smithsonian as an organizing site for the development of a program in what he later called urgent anthropology. And noting the institution's unique position as a quasi-government agency possessing the right combination of funding and flexibility, he also cited the biological underpinnings of human behavior and argued that anthropologists concerned with disappearing cultures and conservationists seeking to protect deteriorating habitats ultimately shared the same goals and should work together to achieve them. So, in a nod to suggestions that were also outlined by Levi-Strauss, Ripley urged the AAA to work with the institution to A, increase the participation of anthropologists native to countries where they would conduct urgent projects, and B, to provide training opportunities for those members of the communities under study who sought to become anthropologists themselves. So it was very much this emphasis on training and outreach that was at the center of what Ripley was thinking about with urgent anthropology, in addition to using this research to bolster his combination of anthropological and biological perspectives within the institution. So this collaboration, he argued, would better serve the aims of what he called a, quote, urgent horizons in anthropology program for a fuller record of man. And from this quote, the urgent anthropology program was born. But now we have to plan it. All right. So with the AAA support, in 1966, the Smithsonian set out to determine the parameters of what became known as urgent anthropology. While Levi-Strauss's speech had made the need for such a program clear, how it would be structured and which anthropological studies and groups of people should receive first priority was much less obvious. In an effort to resolve these questions in April 1966, as Igor mentioned, 50 years ago this month, the Smithsonian hosted a workshop co-sponsored by the Wenner-Gren Foundation to clarify the program's scope and define its objectives. Organized by TACS, the conference was modeled on the planning meetings of other contemporary large-scale research programs, such as those that organized the International Geophysical Year and the International Biological Program. In fact, TACS, in the promotional materials for the conference, deliberately referred to the program as a, quote, international anthropological year, and cited the unrealized potential of the human sciences in supporting global research. Though he noted the inclusion of anthropology as part of the human adaptability arm of the IBP, he echoed criticisms that had been expressed 2 years prior by Margaret Mead, who was against the proposals set out by the IBP committee, saying that its emphasis on human biology would neglect other contributions from other fields of anthropology. So this is, Igor already may have shown you, this was from the issue of Current Anthropology, and you can see the participants here. And here's Mead and TACS around the time of the conference. So in their view, again, urgent anthropology had an important role to play in elevating the scientific status of anthropology at a time when funding preferred innovations coming out of the physical sciences. But in TACS's view, two things were really crucial for its success. First, it could not simply be a salvage program. This would not fly with the discipline. Secondly, in order to achieve its intended global reach, the program needed to include as many anthropologists from as many different parts of the world as humanly possible. So in order to do this, he used the international network that he had already created through the distribution of Current Anthropology, and as a result of this, 48 anthropologists from 22 countries ended up at the planning conference, numbers which perhaps indicate TACS's success as a world organizer as much as it does a collective interest in urgent anthropology. Now, TACS in turn asked the participants to brainstorm strategies in order to figure out the program's logistics. And while he had instructed them not to rank projects in terms of urgency, considerations about how to organize research, and especially how to go about sampling data, inevitably forced them to define what made something urgent and whether or not some projects were, in fact, more urgent than others. While some suggested that the program should concentrate on the documentation of so-called isolated hunter-gatherer societies who were seen as physically disappearing at the time, others argued for a more expansive understanding of culture change and called for increased attention paid to those societies living in parts of the world undergoing rapid development. Debates between these two types of urgent research in turn became tied to larger conversations about anthropology's need to reconceive its disciplinary methods in the late 1960s and coincided with what historians of anthropology have often characterized as its period of crisis. Precipitated by the radical social and political movements of the late 60s and early 1970s, and especially the war in Vietnam, This moment is typically associated with works like Del Himes' Reinventing Anthropology and Talal Assad's Anthropology and the Colonial Encounter, and in turn set the stage for the reflexive turn that would have solidified by the 1980s with Clifford and Marcus's publication. It is a little surprise, then, that the efforts to clarify the meaning of urgent anthropology at subsequent conferences in 1968, and also within the pages of current anthropology, were met with skepticism about the program's supposed neocolonialist implications. In a response to a questionnaire that was distributed through the journal, one subscriber went so far as to say that what was really urgent about urgent anthropology was to, quote, get rid of those who are interested in urgent anthropology, and quickly. Yet in the midst of these debates, in 1967, the Smithsonian did launch a small grants program for urgent anthropology using matching funds that were provided by the Wenner-Gren Foundation for Anthropological Research. The availability of these monies had three important ties to the future of urgent anthropology. First and foremost, it made the logistics of carrying out the program feasible. It made it a reality and not just a topic of discussion. Secondly, because of the relatively small amount of money that they were actually getting, it encouraged researchers to seek additional funds from those countries in which they were doing their work. Finally, it enabled TACS to hire two assistants, Samuel Stanley and Priscilla Raining, both of whom came from the University of Chicago, and were hired essentially to come to the Smithsonian and stay here and oversee its activities. So while TACS had agreed to help direct the Smithsonian's anthropological programming, he only did so under the condition that he could remain at the University of Chicago and come to the Smithsonian as needed. So essentially, by hiring Stanley and Raining, he put them in charge of overseeing the program's day-to-day operations on the ground. And they were also in charge of monitoring the allocation of research grants. All right, moving on. So the official establishment of a program in urgent anthropology at the institution quickly became a topic of concern for members of the Office of Anthropology. Once again, in particular, many worried that the Smithsonian's prioritization of international anthropological research would leave very few resources left over for its day-to-day activities, and especially the preparation of new museum exhibits. Prior to stepping down as chair in 1967, Richard Woodbury warned his successor, Saul Riesenberg, that while he could, quote, understand the desirability of securing funds for urgent anthropology and of associating ourselves with stimulating anthropologists all over the country, the department needed to be, quote, more realistic in recognizing the effect that these things are having and will have in the future on our own individual research activities. So with these kinds of criticisms in mind, TACS approached Ripley and suggested the creation of a separate office that would more closely resemble the kind of international, interdisciplinary epicenter for anthropology that they had originally envisioned. Initially described as a center for international research, he quickly reconceived it as a center for the study of man and recommended that it be placed directly under the central administration of Ripley and Sidney Galler, who was the Assistant Secretary of Science at the time. By including the center under their administration, he argued that it could maintain an independent budget that would not interfere with the museum's functions and would allow it to host programs that complemented but did not duplicate the research that was being done in the institution's museum anthropology programming. So after an external review, in 1968, Ripley redivided the Office of Anthropology into the Department of Anthropology and the Center for the Study of Man. While the department returned its focus to tasks more typical of museum anthropology during the time, the Center for the Study of Man cast its net more broadly. Integrating the individual interests of Ripley and TACS, the center was founded to develop the, quote, interdisciplinary scientific bridges that are essential to improving our understanding of man and his relationships with all aspects of his social, cultural, and physical environments. And they plan to achieve this in a variety of ways, one of which was through the creation of interdisciplinary task forces that would concentrate on one issue a year. So just to give you an idea, some of the proposed topics early on were pollution, overpopulation, warfare, drug use, these kinds of issues that reflected a lot of the anxieties that were percolating at the time. Tax then took these themes and redefined them as crisis problems, as he called them in anthropological terms, which made it possible to apply knowledge gathered from indigenous populations, or so he argued, to pressing issues of global scope. This in turn extended his method of action anthropology to an even broader spectrum of topics. The findings from each year's research would then be compiled and presented at international conferences before ultimately being consolidated and published in the pages of current anthropology. And he did actually later on create a series of world anthropology books that sort of borrowed from this idea, but that was separate from the Center for the Study of Man. In addition to supporting the task forces, the center would also provide an administrative home to other Smithsonian projects that did not fit quite so neatly with the existing anthropology programs. At the time, these included the Urgent Anthropology Program, a program on ancient technologies, the development of a revised handbook of North American Indians, and plans to construct a separate Museum of Man on the National Mall. Tax also proposed several provisional programs for the center, including the creation of 2 new repositories for the storage of anthropological data. So in 1968, the Smithsonian created the National Anthropological Archives to hold the archival materials of the former Bureau of American Ethnology, as well as the personal papers of researchers here and from other institutions. At the same time, work also began on setting up a facility dedicated to the storage and production of ethnographic film, an initiative that materialized in 1975 as the National Anthropological Film Center, today the Human Studies Film Archives. So, and here you can see some of the way that these different disciplines were being thought of in this larger cosmogram of the Center for the Study of Man. So my point in highlighting the center's different components is to show that even though urgent anthropology was defined as a distinct program, in some ways all of its existing and proposed activities became lumped together under this rhetoric of urgency. And nowhere is this made clearer than in an official press release that was included in the 1968 issue of the Smithsonian Torch, which actually included that same quote from Levi-Strauss in the second paragraph. What I find significant about this, however, is instead of relating specifically to vanishing human cultures, it's now being used to support the development of interdisciplinary programs promoting the use of anthropological perspectives for universal social and scientific problems. So some featured quotes include this one from Tax. The problems of man are universal. The very future of the world depends on getting a better understanding of man. Ripley, the single area which needs the greatest amount of attention from discoverers is that uncharted and almost unknown field which might be called social biology. And Stanley, who concludes the piece, we find ourselves today in a rapidly changing world. If value systems evolve out of solutions to problems, and if you suddenly solve a long-standing, really vexing problem of man, the effect on values can be profound. So this kind of rhetoric, particularly its emphasis on the integration of the human and biological sciences as being key to the future of human survival, in turn became a central justification for supporting the development of a number of other affiliated programs that cropped up during Ripley's administration into the 1980s. And it also shows the extent to which these ideas that led to the creation of urgent anthropology continued to be conflated and expanded upon following the 1965 Smithson bicentennial. Okay, so for the last part of this talk before I get to my conclusion, I just want to highlight a few of urgent anthropology's more explicit manifestations and applications under Ripley's administration. And I'm very briefly going to discuss 3 of these, the Center for Short-Lived Phenomena, the Museum of Man, and the Film Center. So the first I'd like to mention is this one, the Center for Short-Lived Phenomena, which, like the Center for the Study of Man, was also created in 1968. But unlike the Center for the Study of Man, it wasn't actually located here in Washington. It was in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where it partnered with the Smithsonian's Astrophysical Observatory. and it was directed by Robert Citron, and the purpose of that center was to create a global communications network that could quickly alert scientists to the occurrence of unexpected environmental or geological events, which would then make it possible for scientists to report to the scene and record that information. So you start getting the production of these kinds of quick data cards, and there's tons of these in the archives recording all the different events that were captured and called in to the Center for Short-Lived Phenomena. So though the primary focus of this center was the documentation of rare and spontaneous geophysical, biological, and astrophysical occurrences, the center also considered urgent anthropology as one of its 4 general categories of events, and you can see that here. So there's not very many of them, but what strikes me as sort of amazing is that the fact that these people who are recording earthquakes and volcanic eruptions are also thinking about the discovery of so-called lost tribes as a short-lived phenomena. And I'm just getting into this part of my research, so it's exciting territory. But what I want to say about it today is that although this center was not included as part of the expanded programming for the Center for the Study of Man, its focus on the international collection and storage of scientific data and its inclusion of urgent anthropology as one of its categories does suggest a parallel initiative that supported Ripley's broader aims to bridge the biological and human sciences. But I think, for my purposes, the most important example of this kind of collaboration are the plans to create a Museum of Man. So other historians have talked about this concept, and Ripley was not the first. There were efforts to include the Museum of Man concept when talks were happening in the 50s over the creation of the Museum of American History. When it was the History of Technology Museum, they thought about moving the anthropology exhibits from here and putting them there and throwing Museum of Man as part of the title. So Ripley is not the first person to kind of use this as an organizational framework. But as part of the programming for the Center for the Study of Man, the Museum of Man took on a new form that, again, combined the imperatives of Ripley and Tax into a museum-based vision of human ecology. So what do I mean by this? As I've already discussed, their imperatives for starting urgent anthropology were very much based in this idea of intersecting anthropological perspectives into environmental and conservation research, and to use this data to inform ecosystem management. Now, Ripley also advocated that in addition to serving as a research center, that museums also needed to be a place for public education, and argued that informing visitors about environmental awareness proved as important, if not more so, than other kinds of scientific work. So in keeping with his feelings about the centrality of education within action anthropology, Tax also supported the museum's potential for introducing a wider audience to the utility of the human sciences. So when the members of the Center for the Study of Man met in 1970 to talk about where their programs were going, Tax actually asked them to organize the meeting around the theme of, quote, how anthropology in the context of a great new Museum of Man can educate the public to the complex nature of some of the major problems facing the survival of our species. So this Museum of Man idea becomes linked as an organizational mechanism not only for Ripley's environmental programming, but also for Tax's plans for the human sciences. And together they conceived of this museum as a kind of social planetarium where visitors could walk through and be informed and presented with the problems that awaited them in the future. So as Jeffrey Stein and others have shown, Ripley and Tax were not unique in this thinking, as other organizations, including the American Association of Museums and UNESCO, had also begun to brainstorm strategies for how to convey messages about the human impact on the environment in museums. But as an early museum advocate, Ripley's ideas provided a concrete example to others of its efficacy. So one publication seen here detailed Ripley's efforts to exhibit ecology, calling it the, quote, hottest or should be hottest issue of the period. This piece concluded by discussing the need for natural history museums to transform and expand their exhibits from showcasing visions of ecology to ones that interlocked biology and anthropology. And she mentions explicitly this transition from natural history into museums of man and nature. More significantly, the same author emphasized the connection between anthropology and ecology with a nod to Levi-Strauss's 1965 speech, and asked whether humans were equally in danger of eroding our natural resources as well as our memories of the past. So, writing about the need for museum collections to preserve examples of both biological and cultural diversity, this example again emphasizes how the ideas of urgency, first articulated in support of urgent anthropology, became tied to other facets of the Smithsonian's planning. And I don't really have time to talk now about why the Museum of Man didn't happen. It was a series of financial and bureaucratic reasons. But I do think, so this is actually what did happen. You got some plaques. Is the best that we got with the Museum of Man. So in a way to kind of make sense of what was happening in the anthropology department, they included the Museum of Man as part of the plaque for the Museum of Natural History. So this was taken in the 90s, but this was taken this past fall outside Constitution Ave. So it's still, you can still visit the Museum of Man every day except for Christmas. But I do want to say that this underlying philosophy that I've been talking about a little bit did find some life in the construction of the quadrangle, which was the last of Ripley's major achievements before he left the Smithsonian in '84. So while many of the proposals for this quadrangle emphasized its use as a site for cultural diplomacy, others drew on notions of urgency and the integration of human and biological sciences as key tools for the future of human survival. And I'm not, again, going to read this whole quote, but you can see I've highlighted some key words that keep coming up throughout this presentation. So again, this idea of integrating local knowledge as an urgent and complex task. We're referencing Margaret Mead and Levi-Strauss as people who have stressed the importance of recording and sustaining traditional cultures. And again, such activity also preserves valuable aspects of the human experience and can contribute to an increasing sense of self-esteem and creativity in local cultures. So these ideas just keep getting recycled and put into other programs as Ripley continues on as secretary. Finally, I can't talk about urgent anthropology without talking a little bit about the Film Center. So, and again, you probably know the history of this, or many of you do fairly well, but early on in the discussions of urgent anthropology in the Center for the Study of Man, there were efforts and discussions about creating an ethnographic film center. And this was quickly embraced as an idea by pioneers in visual anthropology who sought to create a designated repository in which to deposit their films. And as some of you may know, in 1970, the Smithsonian, along with the National Science Foundation and the Program in Ethnographic Film, actually sponsored a conference to devise and figure out how to set up such an archive. Despite a variety of proposals that suggested using it for education and for visual communication, the major arguments for setting up the Film Center, at least in 1970, were very much tied to the rhetoric behind urgent anthropology and the idea that the movie camera could be used as an objective recording device capable of documenting cultural aspects and behaviors, particularly languages and songs, that could not be documented by other means. So as Jay Komiak has argued, this notion in turn became tied to the salvage rhetoric that underlying Smithsonian urgent anthropology and legitimized the prioritization of the production of research films during its early years over the development of its archival functions. And this was largely due to the influence of its director, Richard Sorensen. Again, if you want to hear more about this, I can talk about it, but you may know. So he wrote a lot about this idea during this period. His vision of ethnographic film as a research document very quickly came into dispute with other visual anthropologists who sought to use it more as a means of communication and outreach. But as a result of these tensions, the research film, the National Anthropological Film Center by the 1980s was split in 1981 into its archival components and the Research Film Center. In 83, the Research Film Center sort of faded away, but the Human Studies Film Archives persists and does wonderful work today. So one thing I do want to say, though, is that while the justifications of urgency that helped found the HSFA are frequently written about, and I myself have spoken about them with somewhat negative implication, I'd like to make two quick points that may help recuperate the place of urgent anthropology within the Film Center's history. So first, by contextualizing the Film Center as a product of the Center for the Study of Man, and in turn Ripley and Tax's efforts to integrate the human and ecological sciences, it becomes clearer why arguments about film's use as an objective recording device found some currency within their plans for the Smithsonian. Sorensen's own work argued for the use of film and photography for showcasing changes in surrounding landscapes, as you can see in these images here. And again, this would have resonated with Ripley and Tax. Secondly, recent work by historians of science, including Joanna Radin and Rebecca Lemoff, have begun to articulate the significance of this idea of the as yet unknown as an important factor in the collection of large amounts of ethnographic and anthropological data in the post-war period. The notion that many of the research films made by the Film Center could, in fact, possess some as yet unknown quality holds tremendous significance for the continued importance of these repositories for future researchers working across a number of different fields. Reconceiving urgent anthropology, then, less in terms of ethnographic salvage and more in terms of untapped potential contained within these resources, suggests a new understanding of what is meant by urgency, at least as I'm arguing it, especially as many of the holdings within the film archives begin to deteriorate without proper attention. So I just got cut off a little bit, photo from Karma. And I'm going to return to this idea in a moment in my conclusion. Okay. So what happened to urgent anthropology? In terms of its existence as a distinct program, the small grants program actually did remain active under Sam Stanley until 1978 and successfully funded about 80 research projects in 30 countries. And you can see a little bit of it here in my very rudimentary map. But it also provided support for the collection of museum artifacts, documents, and films that are now held in the Human Studies Film Archives and the National Anthropological Archives. By the end of the 1970s, many of the activities of the Center for the Study of Man had also begun to wane, due in part to Tax's physical absence from the Smithsonian, and also because much of the resources were being put towards the production of the handbook, which actually succeeded better than Smithsonian urgent anthropology did. Now, nonetheless, in 1979, under the authority of Porter Keir, who was then director of the Museum of Natural History, urgent anthropology did become incorporated as part of the Department of Anthropology and was placed under the management of Ives Goddard. And I don't know if you can speak more about it, but it seemed to sort of fizzle out in terms of what I've found, but we can return to it. Yet, as I hope this talk has made clear, aspects of urgent anthropology persisted even after it disappeared as a distinct program. By tying urgent anthropology directly to other anthropological programs that were created at the Smithsonian throughout the 1960s and 70s, I suggest that ideas of urgency expanded well beyond the salvage imperative that was first articulated in 1965 by Levi-Strauss. Instead, urgency provided a rhetorical strategy for the development of new museum and archival initiatives, bridging research in the human and natural sciences. Much of the reason for this expansion must be attributed to the vision and leadership of Ripley and Tax. Although catalyzed by the words of Levi-Strauss, urgent anthropology as a specific program and as a discrete research category remains best defined through their terms. Likewise, it is essential to ground the development of urgent anthropology in the particular historical moment in which it was created. So I argue that So these were all images of events taking place in 1968, some of which you may know or remember. And I argue that Tax and Ripley's thoughts on how urgent anthropology might be applied both socially and scientifically reflected their own anxieties about the rapid transformations and revolutions that they witnessed going on around them. So in some ways, urgent anthropology offered a way for them to find stability in the midst of their own rapidly changing culture. But the emphasis on urgency in urgent anthropology, and in turn its importance for human survival, requires further reflection, and I'd like to conclude on a more personal note. So my work on this topic has always included its own sense of urgency, as I discovered the kernels for this project while interning at the Human Studies Film Archives in 2011. So while I was there, I became enthralled with the history of this project and this idea that you'd create this repository for the preservation of endangered cultures, and it seemed like such a crazy notion at the time. But I could not help but notice the irony as I walked into the vaults and had that smell of decaying film, of vinegar syndrome, hit me every single time. So for me, urgent anthropology became very much tied to the salvage, the physical preservation and salvage of these films. As a historian, I felt that the best way to achieve this would be to write about them and the purposes and reasons for their creation, in hopes that maybe someone someday would take interest in their preservation. I was quite pleased to hear then that towards the end of my internship in August of 2011, a new initiative called Recovering Voices had been founded to help digitize some of the films and linguistic materials that were stored at the HSFA and NAA. I was even more thrilled when in 2013, in the midst of writing my dissertation prospectus, the Smithsonian received a $1 million grant to further support these initiatives. For me, it's thereby difficult for me to ignore what seems to be a direct intellectual and circumstantial tie between Smithsonian urgent anthropology and things like Recovering Voices. So in preparation for this talk, I did a little bit of digging, just to see, to remind myself of when this started. So I found a couple things in order to kind of assess how the language from Recovering Voices may have mapped on to what I'm seeing in Tax and Ripley's justifications for urgent anthropology. So here's what I found. Hi, Josh Bell. In this short promotional piece written by Josh Bell in August of 2011, towards the bottom, he talks about, with current estimates predicting that by 2100, 90% of the world's 6,000 plus known languages will disappear or be on the brink of extinction. Oh, I have this. It is urgent that we address the loss of languages and associated cultural knowledge in communities. And then later, languages hold thousands of years of history and are vital resources for documenting and understanding the Earth's biological and cultural diversity. When languages disappear, society loses unique environmental and cultural information, as well as specific insights into many fields, et cetera, et cetera. Perhaps most importantly, language and cultural knowledge help guide and ground communities in the face of political, economic, and social disempowerment. And then I looked at the website. So the impact of Recovering Voices will create an integrated program of research, education, and outreach to address the challenges facing the world's endangered languages and knowledge. The program will increase public awareness about the loss of the world's linguistic diversity and its implications for all of humanity. It will generate new research on threatened languages and knowledge, and will support the development of new scholars, especially those affiliated with communities whose languages are endangered. Now, I realize that language is a much more discrete unit of analysis than the sort of broad range of subjects targeted by Ripley and Tax. But I think that the themes underlying both Recovering Voices and urgent anthropology strike me as rather similar. Both stress notions of endangerment as a key reason for the program's existence. Both emphasize the global dimensions of their projects and the need to centralize information collected from around the world within the Smithsonian's museums and archives. Both highlight a need for scientists to work together with communities in order to carry out this work. Yet perhaps most surprisingly, at least for me, Both also note the extent to which the documentation and preservation of cultural forms plays into a broader understanding of the relationship between human beings and the natural environment, and even more crucially, that maintaining both cultural and biological diversity through the collection of cultural data is central at both. So to wrap things up, drawing a line between urgent anthropology and recovering voices demonstrates that Ripley's ideas about the use of museums for supporting work that integrated the human and natural sciences may have been more insightful than anyone initially realized. As discussions surrounding climate change and the idea of the Anthropocene continue to make headlines in scientific journals and popular media alike, perhaps it is once again time to think about the ways in which museums and archives can serve as sites for bridging the anthropological and environmental sciences, and the ways that they can, and that how such collaboration may in turn generate new and unexpected areas for future urgent anthropological research. Thank you.